Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out on a Friday afternoon. It's our first time to do a Friday afternoon event, so it's nice to know there are still people who care about nutrition and biofortification, even if it's a Friday afternoon. So it is really my honor to welcome Howdy, or Howarth is his full name, but we'll call him Howdy Buis. He was awarded the 2016 World Food Prize. If you're unfamiliar with the World Food Prize, it's really known as like the Nobel Prize, like the Nobel Peace Prize for agriculture and nutrition, and it recognizes individuals who have improved the quality, the quantity, or availability of food in the world. And in this room, actually, about a year and a half ago, we had M.S. Swaminathan doing a similar talk as what we're having today, and he was the first World Food Prize winner back in 1987. So we've now declared this the World Food Prize winner room, and we hope in the future that we'll continue to have World Food Prize winners here to have conversations with us. So Howdy was awarded this prize last year alongside his colleagues from the International Potato Center for their pioneering work on biofortification, which just means enriching staple food crops with micronutrients. Their work on the sweet potato has improved the health of over 15 million people by reducing what's called hidden hunger, which I'm sure Howdy will tell us more about. Several 100 million people in the future will potentially benefit from his research. Howdy recognized early on in his career that what mattered was not just how many calories people get, but what kind of nutritional value was contained in that food. So he created this concept of biofortification back in the early 1990s, and he's devoted his life to turning that idea into really what's become a global movement that currently reaches, again, more than 15 million smallholder farmer families in low-income countries. Howdy is the founding director of the Harvest Plus program. That is a joint venture created by the International Center for Tropical Agriculture and the International Food Policy Research Institute. At Harvest Plus, he led an interdisciplinary global effort to breed and disseminate micronutrient-rich staple crop foods to really reduce hidden hunger among malnourished populations. We are so honored to have you here, Howdy, and we look forward to your presentation.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming on a Friday afternoon. And I stepped down as Harvest Plus director last October, and I moved to the Philippines, and I'm still working part-time for Harvest Plus, being based in the Philippines. But I'm here on a 3-week visit, and it's great that we can work this out, that I could speak at CSIS. I'm not going to speak at length, and I'm going to keep this fairly informal. And I'm going to try to tell a little bit of my story of how biofortification evolved. So, let's see, this right there we go, got the right one. So I'll very quickly go through the first 20 years of the story. I joined IFPRI as a postdoc, and I worked in the Food Consumption and Nutrition Division. This is back in 1982. And my job was to look at how economic factors such as household incomes and food prices affected diets and nutritional status and health outcomes. And back in 1982, the barometer for better nutrition was calories, full stop. So how does energy intake improve when income goes up? How does it, when food prices go up, how does energy intake go down? So over the next 10 years, to make a long story short, I convinced myself that calories were the wrong barometer. So we did household surveys and collected data on diets, food intakes. We measured anthropometry. And every time I looked at a data set, all those outcomes were related not to calories, but to dietary quality. And I actually found that poor people and rich people ate the same amount of food staples, which was the main source of calories in the diet. And really what differed between low-income households and high-income households in terms of their diets was all the non-staple food intake. Low-income people couldn't afford those things, and high-income people could, and that's what happened at the margin, and that's why people in high-income groups were healthier. And I think what really amazed me was that when I published that finding, and I worked closely with Lawrence Haddad, who's now the executive director of GAIN, was the resistance by economists in the literature to that idea. I thought it was very clear, and the reasons were very clear from the data, but there was a lot of resistance, and that was very disappointing to me. So because I was working in this area, I was attending nutrition conferences and interacting a lot with nutritionists. And it was at that time that they discovered that the vitamin A supplements had reduced on average child mortality among preschoolers by an average of 23%. And at that time, the nutrition community was quite astonished that number was 23%. They had no idea that giving children vitamin A supplements would reduce mortality by that amount. And they got very interested in, then in iron deficiency and zinc deficiency and iodine deficiency. And the nutrition community really shifted about that time. They said, protein energy malnutrition isn't what it's all about. It's about mineral and vitamin deficiencies. So for example, children who suffered from iron deficiency, their cognitive abilities were compromised. It couldn't be reversed. Children who didn't get enough zinc in their diet, they had higher levels of morbidity. They were stunted because of the zinc, and I've already talked about the mortality associated with vitamin A deficiency. So at the time, the nutrition community, they were just getting into supplementation, they were just getting into food fortification, and they were quite optimistic that they could do a lot to reduce those deficiencies through supplementation, through fortification. But it was in 1993 we got a grant from USAID to look into what the CG system, the group of agricultural research centers, what we could do to help in the fight against mineral and vitamin deficiencies. I think at the time we got the grant, they were thinking that maybe the activities of the World Fish Center and our vegetable center in Taiwan, they would be more. We would need to give them more prominence and maybe less prominence to the International Rice Research Institute or CIMMYT in Mexico that worked on wheat and maize. But it struck me that when we had the Green Revolution, all of the modern varieties of rice and wheat had taken over production and consumption, and that our varieties were being consumed 3 times a day everywhere across South Asia. And I said, well, what if we can get the plants to do the work? What if we had bred more iron? What if we had bred more zinc and increased the content through agricultural research? Wow, wouldn't that be more efficient and very sustainable? I'm trained as an economist, and I'm always looking for efficiencies. So I ran around, but I didn't know whether it was scientifically feasible. So in 1993, when I got the grant, so that's the first 10 years. Now we'll get into the second 10 years. So I went around this is a map of the different centers, what they were called and where they were located back in 1995 or so. And I talked to the plant scientists, and I said, can we do this? Can we breed for higher mineral and vitamin deficiency? And time again, I was told, this is a really bad idea. The first reason it's a bad idea is that we're breeding for yield, we're breeding for pest resistance, disease resistance. We don't need the extra work of trying to also worry about the nutritional content of the crops. That means we need a bigger program to still achieve yield gains and add minerals and vitamins to the crops. I knew I could get around that if I gave them money, because then they could have their bigger breeding programs and breed for more characteristics. But I couldn't get around the second objection, and they said you'll probably get a trade-off in yield. You'll breed for higher nutrient content in the seed, and you'll get a lower yield, probably. That was the general opinion. So because I was getting told the same story at center after center, I said, well, I can't get around that because farmers are not going to adopt lower yielding crops. So I made a final visit to a laboratory, USDA ARS laboratory at Cornell called the Plant, Soil, and Nutrition Laboratory. And they'd been commissioned in the 1930s to look at the relationship between minerals and soils and plants, animals, and humans. And I thought, well, if anywhere, these would be the experts that I could ask about this. And I gave a seminar, and fortunately, Ross Welch, who was a scientist there, a soil scientist by training, he stood up at the end, and I was expecting to get the same response, but he stood up and he said, our research has shown that when you load more zinc into a seed, the seed needs the zinc for its own nutrition. It's more vigorous, it's more viable, and you get a higher yield. I said, you get a higher yield. So, I said, well, it's a win-win. You can improve agricultural productivity, and you can improve human nutrition. So that turned the whole thing around. So then I got my first lesson in interdisciplinary communication. I went to our centers and I said, it's a win-win. And I'm an economist, and I was telling plant scientists about plant science, and I had no credibility whatsoever. So Ross worked closely with a colleague at the University of Adelaide, Robin Graham, and he and Robin had, a good standing in the international community. And they went around, and I had them go around. And so we convinced some people, some scientists, that this was something that was scientifically feasible and worthwhile doing. But again, to make a long story short, we couldn't get funding to implement the idea. It took 10 years to get funding from 1993 to 2003. We got a little bit of funding from the Danish aid agency because there was one person that thought this was a good idea, and he could give us $350,000 a year without having any signature of anybody else higher up. So we could do a little bit. But you go to the agricultural donors, and they said it was a time of declining funding for agricultural research. They didn't want to get into new things. And when we went to nutrition donors, they said, no, we don't fund agricultural research. That's not what we do. And so we just couldn't get anything started until 2003, when we got a grant from the Gates Foundation, $25 million over 4 years. They were just getting started. They didn't have an agricultural division. They only had a health division, but they were willing to take the risk. And so we got started. That was the 20 years, well, it was 10 years from the initial visits to the centers that we finally got the funding, and that's how Harvest Plus got started. So let me explain a little bit about what biofortification is. So this is a picture of an orange maize in the middle that's high in provitamin A. The white maize is what Africans strongly prefer. Maize is the most widely consumed food staple in Africa. The simple idea is that we now have these orange maizes that are in high-yielding backgrounds. They're just as high-yielding as the white maize. So the value proposition to the mothers in Africa is, if you'll buy and consume the orange maize for the same price, substitute it 1-for-1 for the white maize, you'll protect your family from vitamin A deficiency. So what do the mothers say when they get that information? Well, their first question is, how does it taste? And so we do the blind taste tests, and they always get it, this is the white maize and this is the orange maize. It tastes differently. But fortunately, they like the taste of the orange maize. So once they like the taste and they have this information, they switch. So it's really just as simple as that. We just need to take all the white maize in Africa and switch it over to orange maize. And so of course it's a long story about how you go through that process, but in essence, that's what the idea is. We had some We had some orange maizes that were not in high-yielding backgrounds, and we crossed them with the white maizes that were in high-yielding backgrounds. And it took 10 years, but over time you can develop the varieties. And there's a lot of science behind it, and I'm not going to go into the science. So that's in essence what biofortification is. But what's the justification? Well, the justification is that it's very cost effective in a very sustainable way. And this is a slide from UNICEF recently that they have now given, in the last 20 years now, they've given out 8 billion vitamin A capsules. So, and they have, it's a very good investment. They've saved, according to the, the slide, they've saved 4 million lives by giving away the 8 billion vitamin A capsules. But you have a recurrent cost, and it's about $1 per capsule when you count the network of people that are distributing the capsules. And so you have the same cost year after year after year. You have a recurrent cost. And so over that 20-year period, $8 billion has been spent on vitamin A capsules. So the thing about agricultural research is you do the research at a central location, you develop the varieties, the seeds, and then you make them available to country after country. They're adapted to growing conditions. They're made available to farmers. They don't cost any more for the farmers to grow than the non-biofortified varieties. You use the same practices. So you don't have the recurrent costs. Your costs are up front in terms of doing the research, developing the varieties. But once they're out in the food system, you don't have these recurrent costs. So for example, what I'm going to talk about all the activities that Harvest Plus has undertaken from 2003 to 2016, we've spent $300 million. And that's compared to, say, this figure of $8 billion that's been spent on vitamin A capsules. And of course, that doesn't count iron fortification and zinc supplements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's in essence, that's the justification for pursuing biofortification: cost effectiveness and sustainability. So will biofortification work? Does biofortification work? Well, when we started, there are three fundamental questions that we had to answer. Can we breed these varieties in high-yielding backgrounds and add sufficient nutrients to have a nutritional impact? Those are the first two questions. Well, these are the 12 main crops that we've worked on. And you can see from the slide that 150 varieties across, it's actually 14 crops now that we've worked on, have been released in 30 countries. And the only way they can be released is if they go through testing by varietal release committees in the countries. And to be released, you have to show that you're just as profitable, just as high yielding as current varieties. So we've answered that question really with a resounding yes. And you can see, you can't see the detail here, but any country colored in dark green or light green is either a country where biofortified crops have been released or where they will be released in the next 3 or 4 years. And so now that number has gotten up to 60 countries around the world. So you can see that it's already a global program, and our challenge now is to scale up. The second question was the nutrition question. If we, under controlled conditions, if we feed the biofortified crops as an intervention group and compare it with a control group, can we demonstrate nutritional efficacy, that the iron status or the zinc status or the vitamin A status improves when the intervention group consumes the biofortified crops? Our very first study was done in the Philippines with a high iron rice. It actually was initiated before Harvest Plus got started. And we needed, because the increment at the time, the increment in the iron was so small, we needed our intervention group to consume the high iron rice 3 times a day for 9 months. And we needed a lot of compliance, day in and day out. And so we hit upon this idea. We found that the iron deficiency levels actually of the religious sisters in the convents, there was a fairly high level of iron deficiency. And after consuming 9 months, and other religious sisters were eating the non-biofortified rice, we were able to show an improvement in their iron status. So we've done it with the vitamin A crops, with the iron crops, with the zinc crops. And we've been able to demonstrate improved functional outcomes. So the cognitive abilities of children in India who eat high iron pearl millet are improved compared with the children who ate the regular pearl millet. Women in Rwanda, their work performance improved when they ate the high iron beans. The vitamin A maize, the adaptation to darkness improved in children who ate the provitamin A maize. And now we've shown that women and children in India who ate the high zinc wheat, that their morbidity levels such as fever were lower as compared with eating the regular wheat. So we've done the nutrition study, we've commissioned 14 efficacy trials, we've published them in the literature, and we've demonstrated and we've convinced the nutrition community that it's an efficacious intervention. So, I knew that, talk a little bit about the orange sweet potato. I knew that when we started breeding in 2003, I knew that it was going to take 10 years before we had the first varieties released in countries. And I knew it was going to be very difficult for the donors to sustain interest if we didn't have any stories about delivery and all the questions about delivery. So already orange sweet potatoes were available in Africa, and I got a separate grant to do a pilot study in Uganda and Mozambique. And the person who led the team that did that, Anna Marie Ball, is here. And the long and the short of it is that we carefully studied. We did pilot interventions in areas where white sweet potato was grown. We had intervention villages where we introduced the orange sweet potato. We had control villages where we did nothing. We did baseline surveys. We did follow-up surveys in both countries. And the long and the short of it was that we showed a huge improvement in vitamin A intakes. The orange sweet potato was adopted. It was eaten. And we showed an improvement in serum retinol and a reduction in diarrhea eventually. So that was a huge boost. When those studies were published, that was a huge boost for the effort on biofortification, because we showed that it would work in a real life situation. And that was all actually published before 2013, 2014, when the pipeline of all the other biofortified crops was starting to happen. So we've been working on getting started on scaling up the biofortified crops. That's the third issue. Can we show a public health impact? Can we get farmers to adopt, a high percentage of farmers in any given country to adopt, and can we show a public health impact? So we chose 8 target countries, obviously for different crops for different countries, and we started scaling up. In those 8 countries, now we've reached about, our most recent number now is 26 million people in farm households that are growing and consuming the biofortified crops. But our big challenge now, I've mentioned 30 countries and eventually 60 countries, so our big challenge is now, how do we make that happen as a global phenomenon, and not just in those 8 target countries? So this is a picture of orange maize marketing. It's already being marketed in grocery stores in Lusaka and Zambia, and you can see the milling company is already advertising the orange bags on the side of its delivery trucks. This is all by way of saying that our challenge now is to get a number of types of institutions to mainstream use of biofortified crops in their everyday activities. Harvest Plus can't do this alone. In fact, our big job is to stimulate all these other types of institutions to mainstream biofortification. So we're getting our CG centers not just to now have side breeding programs for biofortified crops, but to mainstream biofortification in their main breeding programs so that everything that's coming out of our centers is biofortified. And the managements of the centers now accept that they need to do this, they want to do this, and we're seeking funding to do that. We need to get private seed companies where we have hybrid varieties of maize and hybrid varieties of pearl millet. We're getting private seed companies to start developing their own varieties and marketing their own varieties. And we have also with the private sector, you can see that we have the milling companies and the food processing companies. We're starting to get them involved in developing their own products and marketing their own biofortified products. We have to get multilateral financial institutions involved in promoting biofortified crops. Now the World Bank in its loans to countries in Africa is including funds for the scale-up of biofortified crops. The World Food Program in their Purchase for Progress, they want to purchase locally and store locally. So for example, in Rwanda, they're buying high iron beans now instead of the regular beans and storing the high iron beans in their warehouses. We have an effort in Codex to develop a definition and standards for biofortified crops. And finally, we're getting international NGOs to incorporate biofortified crops in their agricultural programs as a way to link their agricultural programs to their nutrition and health programs. And our most developed partnership is with World Vision, and now World Vision has introduced biofortification in its programs in 17 countries around the world. So our vision is that by 2030, 1 billion people will be eating and consuming biofortified crops. So that's where we want to go. We've identified 30 target countries, and if we can capture 20 to 25% of the supply in those countries, we will have reached 1 billion people. So thank you. Happy to answer questions. Thank you.
My first question is, what's going on in that picture before that picture goes away? No, I'm serious. What's happening there?
So this fellow down here is Paul Elona. He's our country manager in Nigeria, and he's full of ideas, and he decided it would be a good idea if I was made chief in one of the villages where the provitamin A cassava had been introduced. And he told me, he met me at the hotel in the morning. He didn't tell me what was going to happen. So I was ready to go, and he said, here are your robes. Put these robes on. I'll come back in 10 minutes and we'll go to the village. So I did, and then we went through this ceremony, and they eventually put these leaves and the whole thing.
It's fantastic.
It was quite a day.
Well, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to have a musical interlude. Harvest Plus, along with others, you use a variety of tools to do behavior change. And this is a video in Rwanda, actually, it's a rap video on beans. And I think it's really fun and interesting, so I want us to watch it. Sorry, we can't see it.
Yeah, that's great. No, I've seen it before.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah! A meal without beans in Rwanda is just like a meal without food.
Ibishimbo bikungahaye ku butare ntibikabure ku ifunguro rya buri munsi biraryoha birimo n'intungamubiri biraryoha utabirya n'uguhomba.
Okay, abana barya ibishyimbo bitari mu butare mu mibiri yabo haburamo abasirikare bakabaho bagaragara nk'abananiwe bakagira n'ikibazo cyo kwibagirwa. Urya ibishyimbo biri mu butare arakomera ntabwo yibagirwa ntabwo ahodomera ejo hazaza he habari heza kuko akomeye abafite amaraso ku kigero gikenewe. Ibishyimbo
Just to show, yeah, it deserves applause. I think it's a great example of how eating beans can be hip, right?
Yeah. I'm just saying, if you want to go download that from the Harvest Plus website and put it in your music list.
Yeah. There you go. Well, I want to start, Howdy, with some personal questions. And one is, you talked about in your remarks the resistance that you had at the beginning and how people told you this was a bad idea. You also mentioned several times how long it took to get where you are today. And now, I mean, wow, 26 million people that are benefiting from your research. And the thought of reaching 1 billion by 2030, it's so impressive. So my question to you is, what kept you going? When research is not easy.
Yeah.
Trying to build this global momentum is not easy. And so what sort of inspired you to keep going?
Well, I think in the first instance, when you work in this area, you want to have some impact. You want to do some good, and so I published articles for the first 10 years, and I wasn't. I told myself that indirectly I was influencing people's ideas, and that would influence policies, but I couldn't really see the direct connection that much. And so when I hit upon this idea, when I saw this idea and I found out it was feasible, I said, of course, if we can make this happen, that's going to be much more important than I publish, a few more papers along the line. So I think it was the power of the idea and the impact that we had. That was the first thing. But still, you can, for that first 10 years when we couldn't get the funding, you get discouraged at different times. And there are a couple times when I said, okay, nice try, nice idea, but nobody's going to fund it. And one point I convinced myself that, okay, I'm going to stop. And I went to see this movie. It was called The Dish, and it was a movie about the NASA space program. And the dish was a radio antenna that was based in Australia, and the signal went from the moon down to Australia, and then it was broadcast around the world. And so it was, it was a moment where the world kind of stood still and marveled at what we'd accomplished as mankind. And it was scientists, not just from the US, but all around the world that worked on this effort. And it was just showed the power of science and what scientists could do and people working together. And I knew that was what biofortification was. Scientists, different disciplines, different organizations, all over the world working together. And that, to me, that was really powerful. And I said, okay, we'll keep trying.
Yeah. Well, so you brought up funding a few times. And so, it took you 10 years to get funding at some point, but right now, as I'm sure you're aware, Harvest Plus is one of 8 finalists for a $100 million grant from the MacArthur Foundation. And so, you won't know for some time whether you're the finalist, but my question is, if and when Harvest Plus gets the grant, what would they do with that money? And is that still enough to be able to get you to scale to where you want to be to reach 1 billion?
Right. Well, what we would do with the money, the funding, the proposal and the funding would be focused on Africa. It would be devoted to the scale up of crops in Africa and all the different things that it would take to, like, for example, the orange maize. I have a vision that, say, 30 years from now, a granddaughter would ask her grandmother, did there used to be white maize? And the grandmother would say, yes, when I was a child, it was mostly white maize.
Yeah.
And carrots used to be white, and we've forgotten that. And now we only think of carrots as orange.
Right.
So that it's money toward that vision that the MacArthur grant. It's not the total amount of money that we need, but it would leverage so many other funds that we'd be able to get. And I think we'd really be there once we got that grant and how we could leverage that for activities even outside of Africa.
Right.
I think that would be really key.
So you brought up orange maize. I
Right.
keep this in my office, of
Right.
course, from your staff. And we actually, Peg from Harvest Plus brought one, and we're going to pass it around. So if you've never held a biofortified orange maize, you get to. You know, one question about this, it's very exciting, right? No, I think it is actually. But one thing about this, you know, you kind of alluded to this, like, do they still want to eat it if it's a different color? So have you run into sort of some cultural roadblocks with other crops as well that people say, I don't want to eat a carrot if it's purple or eat a banana if it's orange?
Well, it's all about giving people information. So if you just put it out there in the market and you don't give information, it just seems like a strange color and nothing's going to happen to it. So you have to give the mothers or whoever is purchasing the information of why it's changed in color. And all of our studies and all of our experience has shown that once you explain the change in color, they easily accept it.
Yeah.
They easily. Now the iron and the zinc, it has to be a different strategy for the iron and the zinc because it's invisible to the consumer. The levels, while they're important from a nutritional point of view, they don't affect the taste, they don't affect the color, so you don't know that it's there. So the strategy is to capture 80 to 90% of the total supply eventually. So whenever you go to the market, no matter what you buy, it's going to be mostly biofortified products. So my analogy is like putting fluoride in the water system. You tell people that it's out there, but they're not that conscious of it when they're in the market purchasing the varieties.
Yeah. So in about a week or so, there's going to be a new World Food Prize announcement this year at USDA instead of State Department. You know, my question, additional question is, what advice would you give to the new World Food Prize winner when he or she or they are announced? Because I'm curious of, you know, since this happened, did winning the World Food Prize change much for you? Did it change your work, your research, your life? And if you had to go back and look back at the last year, any advice you give to future winners?
Okay. Well, I think the main impact or the main importance of receiving the prize is that it gave for advocacy for biofortification. It just gave us more visibility, more credibility. It's one of those boosts that we need to have as you go along. It's like a rocket booster or something. It's just it just helps things quite a bit. It hasn't. I don't know what advice other than just enjoy the. You're asked to speak more often than you were before, but you know, a lot of what I feel like I've done is just repeat myself for the last 25 years, just the same, repeating, and I see people in the audience that have heard me say the same things for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times, but then there's always people in the audience that just haven't heard any of this before. Maybe you were curious what biofortification meant. And
well,
so,
let's go there because I think a lot of people, obviously there's a lot of misconceptions around biotechnology overall.
Yeah.
So talk to us about some of the biggest misconceptions you've seen on biotechnology. And then of course you know which direction I'm going to go, which is GMO.
Right.
You know, is your technology GMO? And if not, why not? And what do you see in terms of biotechnology for the future?
Yeah. So I guess the first point is that I personally feel that I call them transgenics. I like the word transgenics more than GMOs. I think transgenics are perfectly safe. All the national academies of science around the world have put out statements that say the evidence shows that they're just as safe as conventionally bred crops. However, I've been a member of something called the Golden Rice Humanitarian Board ever since 2000. A few years before Harvest Plus got started, and I saw all of the roadblocks, rules, and regulations that have been put in front of transgenics that have really blocked the development, slowed the development and release of golden rice. So I've related in my talk all of the barriers and skepticism about even conventionally bred biofortification back in the 1990s. And I said, if I have to get past all those barriers and get past the fear of transgenics, I don't need that. It's going to be hard enough to prove that conventionally bred crops, that biofortification works with conventionally bred crops. So I made a decision that we would focus on conventionally bred crops. So all those countries in green, all those crops, 150 varieties released, our breeding pipeline is completely 100% conventional breeding. But at the same time, there are some nutrients for some crops where conventional breeding can't get us to an increment that will have a public health impact. So for example, we can't put enough more iron in rice really to have a significant public health impact. So we invested in upstream research on iron, putting more iron in rice and wheat and maize. And we now have transgenic varieties where the level, for rice, for example, they've been tested in the Philippines, they've been tested in Colombia, same results. The increment in iron is at the level, our target level, that would provide a public health impact. Now we have conventionally bred high zinc rice. It's already being grown by several 100,000 families in Bangladesh. The same transgenic variety that's high enough in iron has a much higher level of zinc than the conventionally bred zinc that's already released in Bangladesh. So this is by far our best product. If we could get a high iron, high zinc transgenic rice widely eaten, we could practically wipe out iron and zinc deficiency with that one crop. So we'll see if we can get the funding to bring that to farmers. We're not sure yet whether we'll be able to secure the funding for that.
What's the latest and greatest in terms of any new biofortified crops on the horizons, or when you look forward 10 or 20 years, what do you see as kind of the next big thing in biofortification?
Well, the transgenics would be the
Okay.
first thing, because you can more easily add multiple nutrients much more quickly with transgenics. Mm-hmm. I think our breeding pipelines, the way breeding works, you reach a certain increment level in high-yielding backgrounds, but then you have a second wave, and you have a third wave, and fourth wave. And each wave, as it becomes available, the nutrient level is higher than the first wave. So it's something that's just going to improve over time. Mm-hmm. We're going to have higher and higher impact. We're going to be scaled up in more countries, and the depth of our scale up is going to be deeper and deeper. And so it's a relatively slow process, but it has a huge impact in the end, and it's very sustainable.
Yeah. You know, it seems like when you talked about what inspired you to keep doing this, and you predominantly focus on the poor and the vulnerable in developing countries, and as you know, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals is saying that we hope to eradicate hunger, and of course, biotechnology and biofortification is part of that tool. Yeah. But I'm just curious, your optimism. Do you think it's really possible for us to eradicate hunger?
Okay, so when you say hunger usually it's a terminology thing. It's there's hunger and there's hidden hunger.
Yeah.
Yes, I think we've virtually, except for some famines now, we've virtually eliminated calorie deficiencies, hunger. With the mineral and vitamin deficiencies, it's a matter of, as people's incomes improve, they'll get the diet, they'll be able to afford the diets that they need. There are other things that we can do to improve productivity of the vegetables and fruits and animal products. One of the ideas that I didn't have time to develop is that because of the Green Revolution, the productivity increases in rice, wheat, and maize, actually those prices are lower today than they were in 1970. but we haven't had productivity increases for the vegetables and the fruits and the animal products. And those prices, after controlling for inflation, those prices are 2 or 3 times as expensive today as they were in the 1970s. And so if your income hasn't gone up, it's harder and harder for you to be able to afford. But it's the science is there. If we invest in the science and we invest in improving agricultural productivity, even with climate change, we can develop climate smart crops. We can develop biofortified climate smart crops, and we can solve the problem. But it's a matter of the commitment to invest the levels of funding that are required, and not to not have this variation where it's politically, oh, this is something we're going to invest in this year, and then 5 years later the investments go away, and then food prices go up, and you come back with the investments. I liken it to education, your child's education. So everybody knows that they're going to, for 20 years now, you're going to invest in your child's education. You're not going to say, oh, we're going to stop my child going to school for a couple of years and then get enthusiastic about the idea again later on. No, it's just something that is worthwhile. It's going to have a great impact on your child's life, and it's a no-brainer, and everybody just does it. And that's exactly what agricultural research is. It has a huge payoff. It's a no-brainer.
Let's turn to the audience. Raise your hand if you have a question or comment. We'll come around with microphones. You should use the microphone because we always have a large audience with our live webcast. Let's start up here, right up to the front. The young woman on this side, and then another microphone over here to Tom in the front row. Please stand up and let us know your name and where you're coming from.
Sure. Hi. Thank you for being here today. My name's Kelsey Fagoni, and I'm from a small nonprofit here in DC called Pixera Global. And a lot of what we do is bring tri-sector partners together. And recently we just had a conference focused on solvable problems and bringing the public, private, social sectors together to talk about those. And one of them was post-harvest loss. And it seems like you've had to bring many, many stakeholders together worldwide, centers, academics, farmers. You're trained as an economist. How on earth did you approach and get the buy-in from all of those stakeholders? I mean, clearly it took you a long time, but what was your approach?
Great. Let's take Tom's question and then we'll let you answer. Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you, Kimberly. I really enjoyed this presentation, and although I've heard you speak many times, Howdy, I always learn something new. It was a pleasure to listen to you. I'm glad you brought up the idea of trying to get all of the CGIARs to incorporate biofortification. Right now in Kenya, CIMMYT is trying to scale out in 7 countries or 8 countries, I believe, in East and Southern Africa, drought-resistant maize. I'm sure you're aware of it. Monsanto previously had the water-efficient maize for Africa project that's now at the African Agricultural Technology Institute in Nairobi. I was wondering if you could speak about Harvest Plus efforts to work with Monsanto and the WEMA project and CIMMYT and their efforts to scale out because of climate change. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. You can go ahead and answer those.
Okay. So the broad buy-in from stakeholders, I think the key to it is that everybody has they hold the same vision, that everybody knows where we want to be, what we want to achieve. And then each one of the stakeholders realizes that they have a role to play. And if they don't play their role, nobody's going to achieve their vision. So that's the first thing, to get people excited about the vision. And once you've shown that biofortification can work, then it's pretty easy to get people excited about the vision. And then of course you need funding. You have to have a way of people being able to spend time and resources on it. So that's always a key thing. On the climate smart crops, and the public research and the private research. Absolutely, the whole idea of biofortification is simply to piggyback on the best varieties that are coming out. We have, for example, 26 million people now. It's not anywhere where we want to be in the future, but they're growing biofortified crops. If we don't do anything else, those biofortified crops are going to disappear, because better, higher yielding, more climate smart varieties will be introduced 10 years from now, 15 years from now. So those also have to be biofortified and replace the existing biofortified crops. And that has to happen both in the public sector and also in the private sector. If it's hybrids, I've mentioned, it's the private seed companies that are going to be coming out with the best, most profitable varieties. So we have to create the demand among consumers for the biofortified and also government officials. And so there's the demand, and once the demand is there, the private seed companies will just gravitate to developing biofortified products. Some of the crops, such as sweet potato, cassava, they're vegetatively propagated. That's going to be public agricultural research for the foreseeable future. So we need to get our centers and the National Agricultural Research Centers just to exclusively work on biofortified varieties and not release non-biofortified varieties. That's where we need to be.
Excellent. Let's take some more questions. The woman in the front here.
Hi, my name is Natalie Kronabush, and I'm with Dexus Consulting Group, which is a USAID contractor. And I wanted to ask whether you guys have had any challenges with micronutrient absorption. So with like an iron supplement, you might typically have vitamin C added in there to prompt more absorption. I wonder if you have any issues with that with these biofortified products.
Great question. Dan?
Hi, my name is Dan Silverstein. I'm a private sector strategic advisor, and from the quick look on the map slide that you had, it looked like most of the countries, you said there were 60 countries, it looked to me like most of them were South countries. Is there some reason why we don't see China, Russia, Mongolia, Central Asia, which are clearly have the need and the capacity for the production?
Great. Yep. Go ahead,
Javi. Okay. On the absorption, there was huge skepticism in the 1990s among the nutrition community. What would be the percent absorbed? And some experts, for example, for iron, some experts would say it would only be 2 or 3% absorption, and other experts would say it would be much higher. And I guess the long and the short of it was that it was much higher, that the experts that hypothesized that it would be higher, they were the ones that were correct. So, for example, I put up a picture of the religious sisters, the nuns in the Philippines. So iron is regulated, and if your iron status is very low, you absorb a higher percentage. And if your iron status is high, you absorb a lower percentage. And that came out very clearly in that study for high iron. And it's basically, we're getting the same result for the other nutrients as well. We conduct the studies with meal patterns that are the regular meal patterns that the poor eat in the countries. And we've been able to show time after time that we're able to improve the mineral or the vitamin status through our efficacy trials. I don't know, we actually do have a Harvest Plus China program. I don't know, maybe that was a light green color. It should have been in that map, it should have shown that China was definitely a country that's involved with Harvest Plus, with biofortification. We contacted them in 2004, and we've been having meetings, and now finally the Chinese government is investing in its own biofortification program. We also made the effort in Brazil and the effort in India for those 3 countries. They have very large agricultural research establishments. And all 3 countries now have independently funded biofortification programs. That was part of our strategy. Eventually, yeah, we hope that all countries will adopt biofortified crops, even developed countries. I would like to see orange maize widely adopted in the U.S. I think orange grits, not orange because you're using cheese, but just because it's orange maize. I think that would be much more attractive. And we would be able to get royalties for that private sector business in the U.S., and then those royalties could be used to invest in spreading biofortified crops in the South.
Great. Additional questions? If you have a microphone, go ahead and stand up. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Kevin Lee from Mobilized Construction. We are focusing on rural infrastructure. My question is on food waste and post-harvest loss. I was wondering if there's any research that you've come across in the biofortification to decrease that, or even once crops are harvested, is there a deterioration or degradation of the nutrients in the crops? Thanks.
Great. Go ahead.
I'm Kelsey. I'm an intern for the U.S. Senate Ag Committee, and I'm also a student at Texas A&M studying international ag development. I grow corn and soybeans here in the U.S., and then I lived in sub-Saharan Africa in a rural community helping others to grow corn and soybeans as well. So I've seen firsthand how government infrastructure and transgenic crops make a big difference. And I was just wondering, what do you think it will take, or what could we do better to get transgenic crops in developing countries?
Yeah. Okay. On the first question about, first of all, on degradation, it depends a lot on the vitamin and mineral. There's with the provitamin A in the maize or any of the provitamin A crops, once the crop is harvested, it's processed, stored, cooked, there's actually a fairly substantial amount of the provitamin A is lost. Up to 75% of it can be lost after storage after 3 or 4 months. But when we set our target levels, we had target levels. If this is the level in a non-biofortified crop, our target level is up here, where we would have a substantial public health impact. And that takes account of the loss. So after it's lost and we did the calculations and this much is left, this increment is still enough to provide, say, 40% of the estimated average requirement on any given day. So we've taken that into account. But in general, I think work on reducing post-harvest losses, I think it's important work. But there's so many things that need to be done. Biofortification is just one of the things. So we're not taking that issue on directly. There are a lot of issues that Harvest Plus doesn't take on directly. I was invited to give the ethics department at Purdue University invited me to give a speech, and I didn't know why they invited me. I thought they wanted me to talk about transgenics and the ethics involved in transgenics. And when I arrived, they said, no, we think it's very ethical what you're doing because you're not changing behavior. You're not asking for a huge behavior change. You're just saying if you grow and eat rice, grow and eat a biofortified rice instead of a non-biofortified rice. You're not putting in a new irrigation system. You're not, in some sense, disrupting the culture in a major way. So it's that kind of philosophy that don't change your production patterns, don't change anything you do, just plant a biofortified seed instead of a non-biofortified seed. So that's the idea. So transgenics, what does it take? That's the million-dollar question, and I think we're actually losing ground with that, things being labeled non-GMO. We didn't see that labeling 5 years ago, and now everything's being labeled. non-GMO. It could be that another kind of vision or dream that I would have would be that this high iron, high zinc rice could be introduced in a particular country and have a huge impact. And then people would see the benefit, and then other countries would want it. And then once the dam broke in some sense, then people would forget about all this fear. This, what I consider unfounded fear.
Mm-hmm. More questions? Well, Lori right here in the front, and then over here with the glasses.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Lori Rowley with the Lugar Center. Thanks for being here and for all of your great comments. On the issue of acceptance, you just made it sound like it was so easy, especially with the women. I mean, they're just so smart. And the minute you showed them that there was no change in taste and this was really good for their kids, they were good to go. But a program here actually at CSAS a couple of years ago with some university folks working in sub-Saharan Africa, the researchers told us we really are having trouble cracking the men. And they just don't like the color. And they won't let their women cook these new sweet potatoes or whatever. And so they don't really care that it didn't change the taste that much. And you know, that's okay that it helped the kids, but I like my color. And so can you talk about acceptance on the side with the men and how challenging that's been?
Okay. Good question, Lori.
Hi, I'm a student at Georgetown University. I'm studying in international development. I'm really interested in global food security. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned that the widespread of biofortified food, you know, you're trying to replace some of the low nutrient traditional crop. At the same time, seed banks, you know, all over the world are trying to preserve a lot of different species. So I was wondering, what's your opinion on this? Do you think that biofortified food is somehow degrading plant diversity?
Okay, plant diversity, okay. So the first question on the demand, I'm going to let Anna Marie. She has all the experience with the orange sweet potato in Uganda. She's the expert.
Can you bring a microphone up and we'll go to Anna? Is that okay, Anna Marie? Okay. Maybe stand up and introduce yourself again.
Good afternoon. My name is Anna Marie Ball. I have been working with Harvest Plus since 2006 when Howdy convinced me to go to Uganda and Mozambique and address this issue of color change of a sweet potato because, you know, Africans were never going to accept it. You got part of the story right there, that women actually were easier to convince, and that is because they were feeding their children the orange sweet potato, and after a fairly consistent time, and not a long time, mothers said to us, you know what, my child is better. And I'm a natural born skeptic, and I thought, no, they're just telling me because I want to know this, or they think I want to know this. But I realized after a while that actually I was hearing mothers from a lot of different places telling me the same thing. And I was actually quite humbled because I realized, in fact, mothers do know their children and they're watching them. The issue of the men, they're not really that worried about the color. They're more interested in having a dry, mealy sweet potato. And there is a little bit of a trade-off that you do have with dryness when you breed in the vitamin A or the beta-carotene. Having said that, we have also seen lots and lots of men who see what's happening to their families, and they eat it, and they like it. And we've also learned over time that it also depends on how you cook it. And for those of you that have worked in the field, you'll know that cooking time is a really big issue when you're introducing a new food. If something takes longer to cook, a woman is not going to like that. But at the same time, if it doesn't take as long to cook, you also have to tell them that and say, you don't need to cook it for 20 minutes, you can cook it for 15 minutes. And that's one of the tricks that we've been able to do with the sweet potato is to say, don't cook it for so long, or steam it instead of boil it, and you'll get a dry, mealy sweet potato, which is the preference for Africa.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
So the question about diversity. So the development of the conventionally bred crops very much depends on the existing diversity that's been collected into the germplasm banks. So we had to go to the germplasm banks and find high zinc rices, high zinc wheats that we could cross with the high yielding varieties. Same thing with the high iron pearl millet, the high iron beans, etc. Once the new varieties are bred, then they're also available in addition to the non-biofortified varieties that are already available in the cropping systems. So there's actually more choice and more diversity in the system now as the biofortified crops are being introduced.
Great. Other questions? Let's go in the back here, and Tom can go again.
Hi, my name is Olivia Chapman. I'm an intern here at CSAS, and I'm also a graduate student at the University of Cambridge in International Development. And the bulk of my research that I've looked at has been focusing on soy and soy monocropping, and I noticed that soy is something that's absent from the crops that you've rolled out. My assumption would be because the bulk of soy produced goes into animal feed, that's one of the reasons that it's missing from there. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about transgenics in soy and if you would ever look towards soy in your efforts.
Good question. Go ahead.
Well, that was a good segue because my question is about animal feed. A lot of farmers in Africa and other places use stover, maize stalks, the vines from sweet potatoes, rice stalks, millet, sorghum, as the basis of the animal feed to feed their cows, goats, sheep. And I'm wondering if Harvest Plus has encouraged or suggested that ILRI perhaps look at the impact of using biofortified stover as the basis for animal feed. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Okay, on the question on soy, so what biofortification, its impact depends on the fact that people are eating already high amounts of rice in certain countries, high amounts of wheat in other countries, high amounts of maize in other countries. That's what we start with. And soy just is not, it's not a basic food staple for the most part. So that's why we're not working on it. So that, you know, that's what I can say about soy. On the animal feed angle, when I first made my visits in 1993, I had exactly that idea. I went to ILRI and I said, what about mineral and vitamin deficiencies in animals? And I got no traction whatsoever. They just said, no, it's all about getting them enough to eat, basically energy, maybe some protein. And mineral and vitamin deficiencies is just not an issue with livestock production in Africa. And that's probably not the case, but I'm not an animal scientist, I'm an economist. I think it bears investigation. But you're always short of funding. There's so many things you want to do, and so that's just been something we've never gotten into. But I'm hoping that, you know, the success of biofortification and what Harvest Plus is focusing on will stimulate other institutions and other programs, and hopefully people will look into that. And maybe somebody will get interested in biofortified soy for animal feed. And it just in general, when I made my first visit to the International Rice Research Institute in 1993, and I had an appointment with the head breeder, who later won the World Food Prize. And he's a really nice gentleman, Gurdev Kuj, and he looked at me and he said, you know, nobody ever asked me before how much iron is in rice. I don't know. We hadn't thought about it. And when you look at rice, when you look at zinc consumption, say in Bangladesh, 2/3 of zinc in the total zinc intake, 2/3 of total zinc intake in diets of Bangladeshis come from rice. and nobody studied how zinc content in rice changed from traditional varieties to modern varieties, because it was always yield, it was always what consumers wanted, certain grain size, translucence, chalkiness. No focus at all on the nutrient content of the varieties that they were producing. And that was a fundamental error. And so now we need to change that. And in every aspect of what we do in agricultural research, we need to look at that in addition to all the other things that people are already looking at.
Let's have one final question right here.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeanette Trammell with the Organization of American States. I'm here in my own personal capacity this afternoon. I really enjoyed your presentation. And when you said that as an economist you had difficulty or challenges in talking with plant breeders, I'm speaking as a lawyer to you and saying as an economist and in working in the plant breeding area. Do you have any suggestions of how law can help, how policy tools can be used now in terms of scaling up, or any examples of where you've seen legal barriers or policy barriers in terms of trying to move forward?
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. So we'll just take that one. Okay. Well, I think in terms of standards for crops, we're afraid that, and we're working on this with the codex, people could start, once they become popular, people could start marketing something as biofortified that's not really biofortified. So you need some type of enforcement of particular standards, and that's part of the legal system. And there are also, I think there are legal issues with the release of transgenics. In the Philippines, there was something about the biosafety committee. They had a transgenic eggplant that was released by the biosafety committee in the Philippines, and the anti-transgenic political forces brought the issue to the Supreme Court, and the scientists didn't have a good legal team. And the anti-transgenic had a good legal team, and they convinced the Supreme Court to ban all transgenics in the Philippines, because they just argued it better from a legal perspective, and so there are issues. They finally reversed it. They finally figured out that the Supreme Court shouldn't. They reversed their decision, but they didn't have good information. They got all the bad information from one side, and the other side wasn't prepared for the argument. So I think there are issues there.
Thank you so much, Howdy. It's such a pleasure to have you here and to help educate our audience here as well as watching our webcast. And it's amazing to think about what happened in your mind and what all the work from the 1990s to today. I was fascinated when I was looking at your website. One thing I learned was that the biofortified orange sweet potato was one of the top innovations named in Time magazine's last year, next to like a drone or like, wireless headphones or all these other things, these gadgets. There's the orange flesh sweet potato, which is more mainstream now for it to be in that. And I just think it's really impressive, and we're just so grateful in the community for the work that you've done over the decades.
Thank you.
Thank you.